Imagine a world where women were told their place was only in the home, their voices silenced, their ambitions dismissed. Now, imagine one audacious woman who didn't just challenge that world, she shattered it. She feigned madness to expose a horrifying truth, risked everything to give a voice to the forgotten, and in doing so forged a legacy that changed journalism forever. This is the extraordinary story of Nellie Bly, the intrepid reporter who didn't just break the news, she broke barriers. Welcome to the Dark Chapters. Elizabeth Cochrane's genesis as the trailblazing journalist Nellie Bly began not with a grand career plan, but with a searing indignation at the narrow confines society imposed upon women in the late 19th century. Born in Cochrane's Mills, Pennsylvania, on May 5, 1864, her early life offered little indication of the revolutionary path she would forge. The prevailing social paradigm dictated that a woman's destiny lay within the domestic sphere. Marriage, child-rearing, and the meticulous upkeep of a home were considered her primary, if not sole, ambitions. The bustling newsrooms, the gritty streets of investigative reporting, and the smoke-filled backrooms of political intrigue were undeniably male domains. Any woman venturing into journalism was typically confined to the ephemeral women's pages, offering polite advice on domesticity, fashion, and social decorum, a gilded cage of expectations that Elizabeth, even as a young girl, would intuitively resist. From her formative years, Elizabeth evinced an unyielding spirit, a tenacious independence that often clashed with the era's rigid norms. She possessed a formidable will, a quick and incisive intellect, and an insatiable curiosity that stretched far beyond the predictable rhythms of her provincial hometown. Her father, a prosperous mill owner and local judge, tragically passed away when Elizabeth was a mere 6 years old. This sudden loss plunged her family into unforeseen financial hardship, shattering their comfortable existence. This early encounter with adversity, witnessing firsthand the precariousness of women's lives devoid of a male provider, likely etched itself deep into her consciousness, igniting a fierce desire for self-reliance and a professional life that transcended mere subservience. Though her formal education was prematurely curtailed by these economic constraints, her intellectual drive remained undimmed. Indeed, it seemed to steel her resolve to carve out an extraordinary destiny for herself. The catalyst that propelled Elizabeth Cochrane onto her unprecedented journalistic trajectory, irrevocably transforming her into the iconic Nellie Bly, arrived in 1885. She was then living in Pittsburgh, a burgeoning industrial metropolis, yet found herself increasingly stifled by the societal strictures that curtailed women's ambitions. One particular afternoon, while perusing the pages of the Pittsburgh Dispatch, her eyes fell upon a column that ignited her dormant fury. Titled, "What Girls Are Good For," the piece, authored by a male editor writing under the ponderous pseudonym The Quiet Observer, brazenly asserted that woman's inherent purpose was solely domestic, to cook, to clean, and to nurture children. Any aspirations towards professional careers or intellectual pursuits outside the home were dismissed as unnatural, misguided, or even unladylike frivolity. Elizabeth was not merely annoyed, she was incandescent with rage. Her deeply ingrained independent spirit, honed by years of quietly chafing against such conventions, simply could not countenance such overt, dismissive sexism. Driven by an overwhelming sense of injustice and a profound conviction in women's untapped potential, she seized pen and paper. Her anonymous rebuttal, signed with the poignant and evocative pseudonym Lonely Orphan Girl, was no polite disagreement. Instead, it was a visceral, impassioned, and utterly scathing condemnation of the article's misogynistic premises. She ardently defended women's innate capabilities and their inalienable right to pursue fulfilling careers and intellectual growth. Her prose crackled with raw honesty and a potent, articulate fury that immediately arrested the attention of George Madden, the newspaper's astute managing editor. Madden, a seasoned newspaperman, was instantly struck by the letter's exceptional intelligence, its audacious boldness, and the undeniable, fervent passion radiating from its anonymous author. Intrigued, he published an advertisement in his own paper, a direct appeal for lonely orphan girl to reveal herself. Elizabeth, initially trepidatious about exposing her identity, eventually complied. When she finally presented herself in Madden's office, he was profoundly impressed by her tenacity, her unexpectedly articulate manner, and her quiet but resolute confidence. An offer followed, an extraordinary, almost unprecedented opportunity for a woman in an era where female journalists, particularly in the realm of hard news, were virtually non-existent. It was a groundbreaking invitation into a profession almost exclusively populated by men. Yet, a subtle caveat accompanied this remarkable offer. The prevailing custom of the time dictated that female reporters, if they existed at all, typically wrote under pseudonyms. This practice was ostensibly to protect their reputations, as journalism was universally deemed too coarse, too unrefined, and too morally suspect a profession for any respectable lady. Madden, recalling the immensely popular song Nellie Bly by the renowned American composer Stephen Foster, suggested the pen name Nellie Bly. Elizabeth Cochran, intuitively grasping the profound opportunity to shed the constraints of her birth name and the associated societal expectations, eagerly embraced her new identity. Thus, Elizabeth Cochran formally transmuted into Nellie Bly, a moniker that would, in short order, become inextricably linked with pioneering investigative journalism, audacious courage, and an unwavering advocacy for the marginalized and forgotten. Nellie Bly's initial assignments at the Pittsburgh Dispatch swiftly showcased her distinctive journalistic ethos. Diverging sharply from the polite observational pieces typically relegated to women's columns, Bly gravitated instinctively towards narratives that unmasked social injustices and amplified the voices of the voiceless. Her very first published article under her new, resonant pseudonym was titled "The Girls Evangelizing the World." This was no mere reportage. It was a potent, unflinching exposé detailing the deplorable working conditions and shockingly meager wages endured by female factory laborers in Pittsburgh's oppressive sweatshops. She vividly depicted their grueling, interminable hours, the inherent dangers posed by unregulated machinery, and the pitiful compensation that left these women in a perpetual struggle for bare survival. This was a radical departure from the anticipated women's page content. It was raw, impactful social commentary, a harbinger of the fearless, immersive, muckraking journalism that would define her illustrious career. Following this impactful debut, Bly embarked on a series of influential articles that relentlessly highlighted the systemic plight of the working class, with a particular focus on the exploitation of women and children. She delved deep into the lives of Pittsburgh's impoverished communities, meticulously documenting the squalid conditions prevalent in its industrial. Her writing style was direct, brimming with empathy, and utterly fearless, often directly challenging powerful industrialists and corrupt municipal officials who benefited from these systemic inequities. Her unique methodology involved immersing herself directly in the experiences of the very people she wrote about, a pioneering technique that presaged the immersive, undercover reporting she would later master, and for which she would become legendary. Her courageous work resonated deeply with the working class, earning her widespread admiration, but it simultaneously drew the predictable and furious ire of the city's entrenched elite and the very businesses whose exploitative practices she so boldly unmasked. This inherently fearless approach, though commendable and deeply impactful, inevitably led to escalating tensions and conflict with the management of the Pittsburgh Dispatch. Under immense pressure from powerful advertisers whose commercial interests were directly jeopardized by Bly's incisive exposés, the newspaper began to subtly, then overtly, reassign her to less controversial, decidedly tamer topics. she found herself increasingly confined to the familiar and restrictive terrain of the women's pages, tasked with penning articles about fashion trends, gardening tips, and ephemeral society events, precisely the trivial subjects she had so vehemently railed against in her impassioned initial letter to the editor. For a spirit as innately rebellious and profoundly ambitious as Nellie Bly, this forced regression was an unbearable constriction. She keenly recognized that her potent journalistic voice was being deliberately stifled. Her profound passion for advocating social justice systematically trivialized and diluted. Nellie Bly, a woman of unyielding purpose, famously articulated her profound weariness with being relegated to society teas and how to make lace. Her soaring ambition transcended the narrow, prescribed boundaries of the women's section. She harbored an unwavering conviction that she was destined for a journalistic path of far greater impact, one that presented more formidable intellectual and ethical challenges. Her independent and pioneering nature simply could not tolerate being confined to a role she found intellectually debilitating and socially inconsequential. She yearned to confront the most pressing issues of her epoch, to expose entrenched corruption, and to champion meaningful, tangible societal change. In a move that epitomized her audacious character, Nellie Bly in 1887 strode purposefully into her editor's office and unequivocally demanded more substantive assignments. When her justifiable demands were met with resistance and ultimately dismissed, she made a decision that was as bold as it was perilous. She summarily quit the Pittsburgh Dispatch. Her departure was an immense leap of faith, a desperate, high-stakes gamble for a young, unattached woman with no immediate job prospects in an unforgiving, male-dominated industry. Yet, it was a decision fueled by an unshakable, almost messianic belief in her own formidable abilities, and an unwavering conviction in her calling to a higher, more impactful form of journalism. She intuitively understood that to truly effect change and leave an indelible mark, she required a significantly larger platform. A metropolitan newspaper with the expansive reach and, crucially, the moral courage to publish the kind of groundbreaking investigative work she envisioned. With barely $1 to her name and entirely devoid of connections within the cutthroat, fiercely competitive ecosystem of New York journalism, Nellie Bly, with steely resolve, set her sights on the largest and most influential media market in the nation. She relocated to New York City, determined against all odds to infiltrate its formidable newspaper industry. For agonizing months, she endured a relentless barrage of rejections. The bustling, male-dominated newsrooms were unequivocally unwelcoming to a young, solitary woman seeking serious, hard-hitting reporting assignments. She was routinely offered low-paying clerical positions or, with predictable monotony, advised to confine her aspirations to the inconsequential realm of the women's pages. Yet she persisted, her indomitable spirit fueled by an unyielding conviction in her purpose and a steadily mounting desperation. Her unflagging persistence, against all prevailing odds, eventually guided her to the imposing offices of the New York World, the powerhouse newspaper owned by the formidable publishing titan Joseph Pulitzer. Pulitzer was a figure of immense influence, celebrated for his sensationalist, often controversial, yellow journalism style, but also notably recognized for his willingness to embrace calculated risks and to champion social causes that resonated deeply with his vast working-class readership. Nellie Bly, armed with little more than her audacious ambition and a burning, almost desperate desire to prove her mettle, walked into Pulitzer's inner sanctum and boldly proposed an idea so utterly daring, so profoundly unprecedented, that it immediately captured his shrewd imagination. She laid out her audacious plan. She would feign insanity and orchestrate her own commitment to Blackwell's Island Asylum, New York City's notoriously brutal and feared insane asylum for women. Her audacious objective was to expose the true, horrifying conditions of the institution from the inside, providing an eyewitness account of its abuses. This was an idea of breathtaking courage, laden with immense personal risk. Blackwell's Island was a place steeped in dark rumors and whispered horrors, universally known for its chronic overcrowding, rampant neglect, and systemic brutality. For a woman, particularly one with no powerful protectors, to willingly surrender herself to such an institution with absolutely no guarantee of extrication was an act of profound bravery, bordering on sheer recklessness. Pulitzer, instinctively recognizing the explosive potential of such an exposé and perhaps sensing a kindred spirit in her audacious ambition, swiftly agreed to her terms. This pivotal moment encapsulated the ultimate Becoming Nellie transformation. Elizabeth Cochran had already shed her birth name for a professional pseudonym. Now she would systematically shed her perceived sanity, or more accurately, the outward appearance of it, to embody a persona so meticulously crafted and convincingly performed that it would utterly deceive the shrewd eyes of doctors, the seasoned nurses, and the hardened asylum officials. This undertaking demanded an extraordinary act of iron will, meticulous self-control, and a calculated, sustained performance. She painstakingly studied the outward manifestations of mental illness, practicing vacant stares, erratic gestures, and incoherent speech patterns in front of a mirror. She diligently rehearsed her elaborate narrative, that of a young, disoriented woman recently arrived in the bewildering metropolis of New York, suddenly afflicted by crippling amnesia and bewildering delusions. Her preparation was nothing short of thorough, but the actual execution of her audacious plan represented the true crucible. She deliberately selected a respectable boarding house known for its discerning clientele, astutely aware that any deviation from normal behavior there would swiftly attract notice and, crucially, lead to official intervention. She then commenced her erratic performance, refusing to sleep, maintaining a disconcerting blank stare, and speaking in fragmented, incoherent sentences. Her portrayal of madness was so utterly convincing that the landlady, genuinely alarmed and concerned for her well-being, promptly summoned the police. When interrogated by officers, Nellie steadfastly maintained her elaborate charade, uttering nonsensical replies and feigning complete amnesia of her name or origin. She was swiftly deemed insane, and following a cursory examination by a judge and several medical practitioners who readily concurred with the diagnosis, she was committed to Blackwell's Island Asylum, precisely as she had so daringly orchestrated. The forbidding doors of the notorious institution clanged shut behind her, and Nellie Bly, the intrepid journalist, truly vanished into the terrifying unknown world of the mad, ready to confront the grim realities she was determined to expose. Her remarkable transformation was complete, and her most famous, perilous undercover assignment had officially commenced. Nellie Bly's calculated performance of madness, meticulously planned and boldly executed, had worked precisely as intended. The respectable landlady, convinced of her sudden mental collapse, had summoned the authorities. When the police arrived, Nellie sustained her act, her eyes vacant, her speech a jumble of incoherent phrases, and her memory seemingly erased. The officers, witnessing her erratic behavior, quickly concluded she was indeed insane. After a brief and perfunctory examination by a judge and several doctors, who readily concurred with the diagnosis based on her convincing portrayal, Nellie Bly was officially committed to the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island. The journey to Blackwell's Island was, for Nellie, a deliberate descent into the very heart of the darkness she intended to expose. It began with her transfer from the police station to the courthouse, where the initial assessment of her sanity took place. Here she observed the casual indifference with which supposedly sane individuals, the police, the judge, the doctors, handled her case. No one truly probed, no one questioned deeply. They merely accepted the surface presentation of her madness. This preliminary observation already confirmed one of her gravest suspicions, that the system was prone to superficial judgment, easily deceived by appearances, and too quick to label and discard individuals. From the courthouse, she was taken to a holding facility, a sort of temporary ward for the newly apprehended insane. Here, she encountered her first glimpse of the dehumanizing environment that awaited her. The women around her, genuinely suffering, were treated with a callous disregard that chilled her to the bone. Their pleas, their anxieties, their very humanity seemed to vanish under the dismissive gaze of the staff. This pre-asylum environment served as a chilling prologue, solidifying her resolve to bear witness to every indignity. The actual passage to Blackwell's Island was by ferry, a symbolic crossing over the East River that separated Manhattan's bustling civilization from the grim isolation of the asylum. As the ferry cut through the murky water, Blackwell's Island loomed into view, a desolate, windswept strip of land dominated by the imposing fortress-like structures of the asylum and other municipal institutions. The site itself was enough to instill dread. Grim stone buildings, barred windows, and an air of oppressive silence seemed to hang over the island. It was a place designed to contain, to isolate, and, as Nellie would soon discover, to forget. Upon arrival at the asylum, Nellie was subjected to an intake process that immediately stripped away any vestiges of individuality and dignity. She was led through sterile, echoing corridors, the air heavy with the smell of disinfectant and despair. Her few personal belongings were confiscated. She was ordered to undress and endure a humiliating cold bath, a common practice ostensibly for hygiene, but effectively a form of control and degradation. The water was icy, and the experience was designed to shock and subdue, washing away not just dirt, but any remaining sense of self-possession. After the bath, she was given coarse, ill-fitting institutional clothing, a uniform that homogenized every patient, erasing their unique identities and marking them as property of the asylum. The first staff members Nellie encountered within the asylum walls were far from the compassionate caregivers one might expect in a place dedicated to healing. Instead, she met with a mixture of indifference, cruelty, and blatant incompetence. The nurses and attendants, many of whom seemed weary and hardened by their daily exposure to suffering, often spoke to patients with disdain, using harsh tones and dismissive gestures. Some were openly cruel, deriving a perverse satisfaction from their power over the vulnerable women. Nellie meticulously observed their interactions, noting how quickly they resorted to threats, intimidation, and physical force to maintain control. This lack of genuine care was, for Nellie, as disturbing as the physical conditions. The very people entrusted with the well-being of the mentally ill seemed devoid of empathy, contributing to an environment of fear rather than healing. Nellie Bly's undercover skills were immediately put to the test. To maintain her cover, she had to continue her act of feigned insanity. However, she quickly realized that the outward display of bizarre behavior that had gotten her committed was no longer necessary, or even advisable inside the asylum. In fact, performing obvious madness only seemed to attract more negative attention and harsher treatment. She observed that the truly insane, those genuinely suffering from profound mental illness, often received the worst abuse, simply because their erratic behavior was more difficult to manage. She subtly shifted her approach. Instead of overt displays, she adopted a more withdrawn, melancholic demeanor. She would sit quietly, appearing lost in thought, or stare blankly into space. She spoke little, offering only short, sometimes confused answers when directly addressed. This subdued performance allowed her to blend in, to become largely unnoticed by the overworked and indifferent staff. It gave her the freedom to observe, to listen, and to document the horrifying realities around her without drawing suspicion. She understood that to truly witness life among the forgotten, she had to become one of them, quiet, compliant, and seemingly without agency. The conditions within the Blackwell's Island Asylum were horrifying, even by the lax standards of the late 19th century. Nellie was immediately struck by the pervasive cold, The wards were unheated, even in the depths of winter, leaving patients shivering and exposed. The sanitation was appalling. Bathrooms were filthy, and there was a constant putrid smell that permeated the entire facility. The food was scarce and virtually inedible, often stale bread, rancid butter, and foul-smelling water. Patients were forced to eat from dirty tin plates, often without utensils, struggling to consume the meager, unappetizing meals. Many were constantly hungry, their physical health deteriorating alongside their mental state. Overcrowding was another major issue. Wards designed for a fraction of the current population were crammed with hundreds of women. Patients were forced to sleep on hard cots, often without sufficient blankets, packed so tightly together that there was little personal space or privacy. The lack of proper ventilation and the close quarters contributed to the spread of disease, creating a breeding ground for illness. Nellie witnessed women suffering from various ailments, both physical and mental, receiving little to no proper medical attention. Doctors were few and far between, and their visits were cursory at best, rarely involving genuine examination or personalized care. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect was the pervasive cruelty inflicted by the attendants. Nellie meticulously documented countless instances of physical and psychological abuse. Nurses would routinely beat patients, often for minor infractions or simply out of frustration. They would drag women by their hair, tie them down with ropes, or force them into frigid baths as punishment. Verbal abuse was constant, with attendants hurling insults, mocking patients' delusions, and screaming at them without provocation. Nellie witnessed firsthand the terror in the eyes of the patients, the resigned despair on their faces as they endured these daily torments. She saw how the power dynamics within the asylum allowed the staff to act with impunity, knowing their actions would go unreported or unpunished. One particular incident stood out to Nellie, a harrowing illustration of the asylum's brutality. She witnessed attendants repeatedly force cold water down the throats of patients who refused to drink, even those who were genuinely unable to swallow due to their illness. This wasn't for hydration, it was a form of torture, a forceful and dehumanizing act designed to break the patient's will. She saw women being tied to chairs for hours, left exposed to the elements, or confined to straitjackets for days on end, their pleas for release ignored. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic pattern of abuse that had become normalized within the institution. The attendants, many of whom were poorly trained and underpaid, seemed to have internalized the belief that the patients were less than human, deserving of nothing but contempt and control. Nellie also realized the chilling ease with which truly sane women could find themselves trapped within Blackwell's Island. She met several inmates who, like herself, appeared lucid and rational, but had been committed due to unfortunate circumstances, family disputes, or a lack of legal recourse. These women, desperate to prove their sanity, were met with disbelief and further accusations of delusion. The more they protested, the more insane they were deemed. Nellie understood that the system offered no easy escape for those unjustly committed. Once inside, the label of insane became an almost indelible mark, trapping individuals in a bureaucratic and abusive nightmare. The very institution meant to help them instead became their prison, perpetuating their suffering and denying them any hope of release. Nellie's heart ached for these sane patients, whose plight mirrored her own fabricated predicament, but without the safety net of knowing it was all an elaborate charade. She knew her mission was not just to expose the conditions, but to be a voice for those who truly had none. After successfully navigating the treacherous initial steps of gaining admission, Nellie Bly's true mission began: to live and observe life among the forgotten within the walls of Blackwell's Island Asylum. Her forced immersion into this hidden world of suffering revealed horrors far beyond mere neglect. It uncovered a systematic dehumanization of patients that was both chilling and pervasive. The daily routine was a monotonous cycle of depravity, designed seemingly to break the spirit rather than heal the mind. The physical environment itself was a constant assault on the senses. Nellie meticulously documented the biting cold that permeated the wards, even in what passed for common areas. Patients shivered constantly, often wrapped in inadequate, threadbare blankets. The heating system, if it existed at all in many sections, was entirely insufficient or simply ignored. This pervasive chill contributed to a constant state of discomfort and illness among the already vulnerable population. The air, heavy and stagnant, was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale food, and overflowing waste. Sanitation was a myth. Bathrooms were perpetually filthy, often lacking basic necessities like soap or towels. The absence of proper ventilation meant the foul odors clung to everything, creating an oppressive atmosphere of decay and despair. Food, when it arrived, was a cruel parody of sustenance. Nellie described meals that were consistently meager, unappetizing, and often inedible. Stale bread, rancid butter, and a watery gruel were staples. Meat, if served, was often spoiled or riddled with gristle. Patients were forced to eat from dirty tin plates, frequently without forks or spoons, resorting to using their hands. The water provided was often foul-smelling and undrinkable. Constant hunger gnawed at the patients, exacerbating their physical and mental deterioration. Nellie noted that many genuinely ill patients, too weak or confused to eat, were simply left to starve, their untouched portions removed without a second thought. The caloric intake was so low that even healthy individuals would struggle to maintain their strength, let alone those battling severe mental health conditions. This deliberate deprivation of basic nourishment was a form of slow torture, further weakening the patient's already fragile states. Overcrowding was rampant, transforming already dismal wards into suffocating penitentiaries. Rooms designed for a handful of patients were crammed with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of women. Cots were placed so close together that there was no personal space, no privacy, and no respite from the constant presence of others' suffering. The sheer density of bodies created an environment ripe for the spread of infectious diseases. Nellie witnessed patients with various contagious ailments housed alongside others, with no attempt at isolation or proper medical care. The lack of proper ventilation in these tightly packed spaces only intensified the risk, turning the asylum into a breeding ground for both physical and mental decline. The most disturbing aspect of life among the forgotten, however, was the systemic cruelty inflicted by the nurses and attendants. Nellie Bly's reports detailed a horrific pattern of abuse that went beyond mere neglect, venturing into deliberate torment. She witnessed countless instances of physical violence. Nurses would routinely beat patients, often for minor infractions or simply out of frustration at their own demanding jobs. Women were dragged by their hair, their heads slammed against walls or subjected to painful twists of their limbs. Verbal abuse was incessant, a constant barrage of insults, mockery, and screaming. Attendants openly ridiculed patients' delusions, their cries for help, or their genuine distress. This psychological torment was just as damaging as the physical assaults, chipping away at the patient's self-worth and pushing them further into their despair. Nellie documented specific, harrowing methods of control and punishment. Cold baths, already used as part of the intake process, were employed as a form of therapy, or punishment, regardless of the patient's physical state or the prevailing temperature. Women would be forced into frigid water, held down, and scrubbed roughly with coarse brushes, often until their skin turned raw and bleeding. For patients who refused to eat or drink, force-feeding was common, but often conducted with a brutality that bordered on torture. Nellie specifically described instances where attendants would forcefully pour ice-cold water down patients' throats, a horrifying ordeal that caused choking and terror. Restraint was also commonplace, but not as a last resort for safety. Patients were routinely tied to chairs for hours on end, left in uncomfortable positions, or confined to straitjackets for days, their pleas for release ignored. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a normalized, ingrained culture of brutality where staff acted with impunity, knowing their actions would go unchallenged. The indifference of the higher-ups, particularly the visiting doctors, was equally damning. Doctors' rounds were cursory at best. They would sweep through the wards, barely glancing at patients, or making quick, superficial diagnoses without genuine examination. Patients' desperate attempts to communicate their suffering or articulate their sanity were dismissed as symptoms of their illness. Nellie observed that the more a patient protested their commitment or argued for their lucidity, the more firmly the staff seemed to believe they were indeed insane. This created a perverse trap. The very act of asserting one's sanity was interpreted as a sign of madness, further entrenching individuals in their confinement. Medications, when given, were often administered indiscriminately, without proper diagnosis or monitoring, sometimes simply to sedate difficult patients. Crucially, Nellie Bly realized the chilling ease with which sane individuals could be committed and subsequently trapped within Blackwell's Island. She encountered several women who, like herself, appeared entirely lucid and rational. These individuals had been committed due to unfortunate circumstances, such as family disputes where relatives sought to rid themselves of an inconvenient presence, or because they lacked legal or social recourse. Some were immigrants who simply couldn't communicate effectively, their confusion mistaken for psychosis. Once inside, the label of insane became an almost indelible mark. Their protests were ignored, their pleas for outside contact denied, and their attempts to prove their sanity were only met with further accusations of delusion. The asylum, ostensibly a place of healing, became an inescapable prison, perpetuating their suffering and extinguishing any hope of release. Nellie's heart ached for these genuinely sane patients, whose desperate plight mirrored her own fabricated predicament, but without the crucial safety net of knowing it was all a carefully constructed charade. She recognized that her mission was not merely to expose the physical conditions, but to be an irrefutable voice for those who had been utterly silenced and truly had no one to speak on their behalf. The depths of their despair, the utter hopelessness etched onto their faces, solidified her resolve to ensure that their stories, once exposed, could never again be forgotten. Nellie Bly's calculated descent into the harrowing world of Blackwell's Island Asylum had been meticulously planned, but her exit strategy, while always part of the overarching scheme, presented its own set of unique and perilous challenges. She had to navigate the system's inertia and the staff's hardened skepticism, all while maintaining her cover without succumbing to the genuine despair and psychological toll of her environment. Her initial plan was to stay for 10 days, a period she believed sufficient to gather enough damning evidence. However, the days inside the asylum felt like an eternity, each one bringing new layers of horror and a growing sense of urgency to escape and expose the truth. As her 10 days approached, Nellie needed a way to signal to the world that she was ready to be released. This was a critical point. She couldn't simply snap out of her feigned madness. That would raise suspicion and undermine her credibility. Instead, she subtly began to alter her behavior, gradually presenting herself as rational, albeit still quiet and subdued. She started speaking coherently, engaging in sensible conversations and demonstrating a clear awareness of her surroundings. Her aim was to appear cured, or at least significantly improved, rather than a sudden, miraculous recovery. This gradual shift was intended to avoid any alarm bells and facilitate a smoother exit from the institution. However, extracting a patient from Blackwell's Island was not a simple matter. Once committed, individuals faced an uphill battle to prove their sanity, and the system was designed to keep them confined. The very acts of protesting or asserting one's lucidity were often interpreted by the staff as further evidence of mental instability. Nellie had to be careful not to fall into this trap. She relied on the newspaper's promise to arrange for her release, a promise made by Joseph Pulitzer himself. Pulitzer, a man who understood the sensational power of her mission, had sent lawyers to the asylum to inquire about a patient fitting Nellie's description. The legal team had to navigate a bureaucratic maze, petitioning the asylum superintendent and arguing for the patient's release, all while carefully avoiding revealing the true purpose of her incarceration. On January 21, 1887, after 10 harrowing days inside, the world's lawyers finally succeeded. Nellie Bly was formally discharged from Blackwell's Island Asylum. Stepping out of those gates and back into the bustling world of New York City was a profound moment of liberation, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence and confinement she had endured. Yet the experience left an indelible mark on her. The sights, sounds, and smells of the asylum, the faces of the suffering women she left behind, these images would haunt her for years. The physical ordeal was over, but the psychological burden of bearing witness to such widespread abuse was immense. The very next day, January 26, 1887, the New York World unleashed Nellie Bly's exposé, 10 Days in a Madhouse. The series, published in 2 parts, immediately became a sensation. It was a journalistic bombshell, a raw, unflinching, and unprecedented eyewitness account of the horrors within the asylum. Nellie Bly's prose was vivid and visceral, painting a grim portrait of a system that actively harmed rather than healed. She detailed every chilling observation: the icy baths, the meager and spoiled food, the unsanitary conditions, the constant physical and verbal abuse from attendants, and the heart-wrenching plight of genuinely sane women trapped within the asylum's walls. Her narrative was deeply personal, allowing readers to experience the terror and dehumanization alongside her. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. 10 Days in a Madhouse gripped New York City and quickly resonated across the nation. Readers were horrified by the revelations, outraged that such barbarity could exist within a public institution meant to care for the vulnerable. The story became a powerful indictment of the prevailing attitudes towards mental illness and the shocking lack of oversight in public. It wasn't just a sensational tale, it was a call to action. People demanded accountability and reform. The impact of Nellie Bly's exposé was swift and substantial. Within days of the article's publication, a grand jury was convened to investigate the conditions at Blackwell's Island Asylum. This was a direct result of the world's reporting and the public outcry it generated. Nellie Bly herself was called to testify before the grand jury. Her testimony was powerful and compelling, as she recounted her experiences with chilling detail, providing first-hand evidence of the abuses she witnessed. She presented irrefutable proof that her reporting was not exaggerated sensationalism, but an accurate depiction of a dire reality. She also suggested concrete reforms, demonstrating that her intent was not just to expose, but to inspire tangible change. The grand jury's findings largely corroborated Nellie Bly's exposé. They confirmed the inhumane conditions, the rampant abuse, and the systemic neglect. The report condemned the asylum's practices and recommended significant changes. As a direct consequence of her work, the city of New York allocated an additional $1 million, 0 cents, a staggering sum at the time, equivalent to over $30 million, 0 cents today, to the Department of Public Charities and Correction, specifically earmarked for immediate improvements to the city's mental institutions. This funding was crucial. It led to fundamental changes in the care of the mentally ill. The reforms enacted were widespread and long-lasting. Attendants who had been identified as abusive were fired. More qualified and compassionate nurses were hired, and a greater emphasis was placed on proper training for staff. The food quality improved significantly, with increased portions and more palatable meals. Basic sanitation measures were finally implemented, leading to cleaner wards and improved hygiene for patients. Perhaps most importantly, a more rigorous system was put in place to evaluate patients upon admission and to ensure that genuinely sane individuals were not unjustly committed. The asylum, once a symbol of horror and despair, began a slow but crucial transformation towards becoming a place that offered actual care rather than just confinement. Nellie Bly's 10 Days in a Madhouse solidified her reputation as a fearless investigative journalist, a pioneer of stunt journalism and undercover reporting. She had not only revealed a hidden truth, but had also demonstrated the profound power of journalism to affect real-world change. Her method of immersion, living the story rather than just observing it, became a blueprint for future investigative reporters. She showed that a journalist could be more than a chronicler of events. She could be an agent of social reform. Her work inspired countless journalists, particularly women, to pursue investigative reporting and to use their pens as tools for justice. Beyond the immediate reforms, Nellie Bly's exposé forced a crucial public dialogue about mental health. Prior to her articles, mental illness was often viewed with fear, shame, and a desire to simply hide away those afflicted. Her work brought the plight of the insane into the public consciousness, making it impossible to ignore. She humanized the patients, revealing them not as nameless, faceless, mad individuals, but as suffering human beings deserving of dignity and proper care. This shift in public perception was arguably as important as the institutional reforms, laying groundwork for future mental health advocacy. 10 Days in a Madhouse established Nellie Bly not just as a journalist, but as a crusader for social justice and women's rights. Her courageous act shattered the perception that women were too delicate or emotional for hard-hitting journalism. She proved that a woman could not only enter male-dominated fields, but could excel in them, using her unique perspective and empathy to uncover truths that others might miss. She became a role model for aspiring female journalists, demonstrating that their voices were powerful and necessary. Her willingness to put herself in harm's way for the sake of a story and for the greater good became legendary. The impact of 10 Days in a Madhouse extended far beyond the walls of Blackwell's Island. It sent a resounding message that the forgotten would no longer remain unseen, and that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, would find a voice in Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly's courageous infiltration of Blackwell's Island Asylum, culminating in her groundbreaking exposé 10 Days in a Madhouse, transcended a mere journalistic scoop. It irrevocably altered the landscape of American journalism and profoundly impacted the burgeoning women's rights movement. Her work did not just make headlines. It set new precedents for reporting, shattered gender barriers, and ignited crucial conversations about social justice that resonate to this day. Foremost among her contributions was the popularization of stunt journalism and undercover reporting. While the concept of immersive reporting existed in nascent forms, Bly elevated it to an art form, demonstrating its unparalleled power to uncover truths hidden from conventional inquiry. She didn't just interview officials or observe from a distance. She lived the story, becoming a participant in the very system she sought to expose. This immersive technique provided an unparalleled level of authenticity and detail to her reporting, making it impossible for readers to dismiss her accounts as mere speculation or exaggeration. Her method of being the story became a blueprint for countless future investigative journalists, particularly those seeking to expose corruption and systemic failures in institutions. It showed that personal experience, meticulously documented, could be the most potent tool for reform. Beyond method, Bly's work ushered in a new era of social justice journalism. Her focus was never on trivialities. It was consistently on the plight of the marginalized and the systemic injustices overlooked by society. From the sweatshops of Pittsburgh to the inhumane conditions of the asylum, she used her platform to give a voice to the voiceless. Her articles were not just sensational, they were catalysts for change, demanding accountability from those in power and inspiring public outcry. This dedication to exposing societal ills elevated journalism from mere information dissemination to a powerful instrument of advocacy and reform. She proved that a newspaper could be a force for good, capable of influencing policy and improving lives. Perhaps one of her most profound impacts was on women in journalism. In an era when women were largely confined to society pages or secretarial roles, Bly burst onto the scene as a force of nature. She defied the stereotype that women were too fragile or emotional for hard-hitting news. Her audacious proposal to feign insanity, her courage in facing the horrors of the asylum, and her sharp, unyielding prose demonstrated that women were not only capable of serious journalism, but could excel at it with a unique blend of empathy and fearless determination. She proved that a woman could be brave, intelligent, and influential in a male-dominated profession. Nellie Bly became an undeniable role model for aspiring female journalists, opening doors and challenging assumptions about women's capabilities in the newsroom and beyond. She showed that their perspective was not just valid but vital for comprehensive reporting. Her influence extended directly into mental health reform. 10 Days in a Madhouse directly led to a grand jury investigation, a significant increase in funding for mental institutions, an additional $1 million, 0 cents, equivalent to over $30 million, 0 cents today, and tangible improvements in patient care at Blackwell's Island and other facilities. Attendants were fired, training improved, and basic human dignity was incrementally restored, including, simply, to identify the cause of madness and to confront the horrific realities of how it treated its mentally ill, sparking a critical public discourse that had been long overdue. Her work was a pivotal step in moving mental health care from mere warehousing to a more compassionate and humane approach. Beyond specific reforms, Bly also had a significant impact on public perception and empathy. By sharing her personal experience from within the asylum, she humanized the insane. She showed them not as monstrous or subhuman figures to be locked away and forgotten, but as individuals suffering, often unjustly, who deserved compassion and proper care. Her vivid descriptions fostered empathy in readers, making it impossible to remain indifferent to the plight of those confined to such institutions. This shift in public consciousness was crucial for sustained reform efforts in mental health care. Finally, Nellie Bly's career trajectory demonstrated the evolving power of the press itself. Her partnership with Joseph Pulitzer and the New York World highlighted how sensationalism, when coupled with a genuine desire for social good, could capture public attention and drive meaningful change. She proved the immense influence a newspaper could wield, not just in reporting news, but in making news and shaping public opinion to advocate for the vulnerable. Her work was a testament to the idea that journalism had a moral imperative beyond simply relaying facts. In essence, Nellie Bly's impact on journalism was multifaceted. She redefined investigative reporting through immersion, championed social justice causes, shattered gender stereotypes in the newsroom, directly spurred significant institutional reforms, and fostered greater public empathy. Her legacy is not just one of a daring individual, but of a trailblazer who pushed the boundaries of her profession, proving that courage, empathy, and a keen eye for injustice could transform both journalism and society itself. Her name remains synonymous with fearless, impactful reporting, a standard for generations of journalists who followed in her footsteps. Nellie Bly's relentless courage didn't just reform asylums, it redefined what a journalist and a woman could achieve. Her story is a powerful reminder that speaking truth to power, no matter the risk, can spark monumental change. What part of Nellie's incredible journey resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. If you were inspired by her bravery and her impact on journalism, please give this video a like, subscribe to The Dark Chapters for more captivating true stories of unsung heroes, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear about the woman who truly changed the world with her words.